I feel after your fabulous introductory story that I'm afraid I'm not going to be provocative enough. But I'm sure that we can do something about that in the question and answer session. I almost read your speech now. So first of all, thank you all for coming on a cold and drizzly night. And you do realize that you risk me going back to California with all of my stereotypes about weather in Toronto confirmed. And before this trip, all the Torontonians in NIF said, oh, May is going to be perfect. It will be beautiful. You'll see. It's like San Francisco. Not so much like San Francisco. This is actually quite like San Francisco. That's absolutely right. We moved to San Francisco a few years ago, and my wife and LA-born daughters, all three born in Los Angeles, moved to San Francisco, and they said, what did you do? You dragged us to a place that is not the California that we know. But that's what we have in common. A lot of gray and drizzle, but it builds character, I think. And I have to say, although it sounds like a cliched segue, that the weather has been offset by the welcome that I've gotten from you all in Toronto and in Canada. And it's really nice for you all to schlep on a night like this out to hear me speak. I know that there are lots of other things you could be doing on a Monday. And so I hope that we'll have some fun and have an interesting conversation. I'd like to speak for a little while. I think we called this talk Loving Israel in Complicated Times. And I do want to focus on that. And then I want to really open it up to a conversation. And as Ellie said, I have no doubt this is the case, especially in Canada, because this is another one of your reputations by stereotype. You are a kind and polite people. In fact, when Jay, our Canadian staffer, heard my 6-year-old say to me on the phone yesterday about her sleepover, Dad, I was really good. I said, thank you. I said, please. I said, please, excuse me. And I heard him mutter, your daughter could be Canadian. So I think that that's a wonderful trait. So even when we disagree with each other, I know that we will do it with the civility and respect that you all are an example of, which is my way of saying, please don't yell at me. Look, the problem with giving a conversation about loving Israel in complicated times is that we live in such complicated times that the talk that I thought I wanted to give and the conversation I thought we would have afterwards has already changed, right? And I got out of a meeting here. I took the red eye from San Francisco on Saturday night, got here on Sunday, and halfway through Sunday, Joan, I think it was, actually said, you know, what do you think, what's going to happen now that we have this news from the north? And of course, my response, having been in meetings for half the day, is what are you talking about? And those are the times that we live in. Events develop so rapidly and they change so quickly that it's very hard to get a bead on what the situation is, let alone how we as a North American community that loves and supports Israel, no matter what our political affiliation might be, how we can relate to it. So let's acknowledge, let's stipulate to each other that even the current situation is one in flux. It's very worrying for all of us. I don't know that I have any profound insights to share with you about what's happening. I can tell you certainly what I've been hearing all day as I've been on the phone with our folks on the ground in Israel. And when we get to the questions and answers, let's certainly try to unpack some of that. But I think that as we say in Talmudic study, kal v'chomer, right? It's always difficult and challenging and complicated to navigate this conversation, and even more so now, given the last few days and the last few weeks. I mean, right? Today it's challenges at the northern border. A couple of weeks ago it was the Fatah-Hamas reunification. A couple of weeks before that it was Libya and Syria. A couple of weeks before that it was Egypt and. Now, so we've got quite a task, because the truth is what New Israel Fund is dedicated to is the soul of Israel, which is to say there are a host of organizations from the right, center, and left in the Jewish spectrum in Canada and the United States and of course in Israel that are devoted to a vision of the way that Israel could live alongside of its neighbors. Again, right to left, there are a lot of groups dedicated to an Israel at peace with its neighbors. New Israel Fund is an organization dedicated to realizing an Israel at peace with itself. And I like to say, in the United States context, whether you are left or right, whether you are an AIPAC or a J Street Jew, you should be a New Israel Fund Jew. And I have no idea how to make the analog here in Canada, but I hope that you'll see what I mean by the end of the conversation. Now, before I talk about the situation that I think we as a diasporic community find ourselves in vis-a-vis Israel, and by that I mean largely the self-selectors who are in this room because we care, no matter from what angle we care, we have in common the fact that we're desperately concerned with what's happening in Israel. And I'm going to argue to you in a few moments that that does not characterize coming generations of young Jews in my country. And I can't obviously speak to what your situation here in Canada is, but certainly I'm going to put on the table an initial premise that the way I would characterize the coming generations of American Jewry in terms of their relationship with Israel is as a vector of drift and disaffiliation away from meaningful engagement with Israel. So that's a foundational idea that I want to put on the bima, and I want later for you to tell me how that relates to Canada and your experience. But before we get into this, let's do a couple of quick things. I want to do a quick contextual history 101 reminder lesson, and then I want to tell you, because I know that you all don't know, what it is NIF is and why this is of such concern to us at the New Israel Fund. So it's hard to remember in 2011 that the State of Israel was founded by people who largely conceived of a society with two big parts. There was the government, which made the decisions and allocated the resources and charted the direction of the state, and then there were the people who received these directions and allocations. Now, it was a democratic and relatively liberal state that was founded, but it was founded by Eastern European socialists who had this concept of a state in mind. And as late as the 1970s, Israel didn't have what we in the United States would call a nonprofit sector, a civil society sector, the kinds of things that Canada, the US, much of Western Europe boast, that rich ecosystem of nonprofit organizations and non-governmental organizations that serve in an interstitial role between the government, the state, and the people, representing voices of marginalized communities, of minorities, of women, of gay folks, representing groups that are working to protect the environment, protect human rights. This sector was largely absent in Israeli society. And in 1979, 4 people from the San Francisco Bay Area, that's just an ironic coincidence that I live there now, observing this lack of civil society in Israel and believing that a vital and vibrant civil society was a necessary ingredient to the continued emergence of Israel as a liberal democracy, founded the New Israel Fund. They were dissatisfied with the opportunities for philanthropy that then existed. Really, you had a couple of choices. There were in the United States, American Friends of, fill in the blank, the university, the zoo, the theater, and then there was the federated system. And believe me, as the former CEO of the San Francisco Federation, which, depending on who you speak with, and by this I mean people in Chicago and Miami, is the 3rd largest Jewish community in North America. The Chicagoans and the Miamians argue that it's not the case. But that's an argument I've had with my Federation colleagues for a long time. They believed that, one of the fastest ways to building an Israel that fulfilled the founding vision of the State of Israel, the values enshrined in the Declaration of Independence, was to create a third option, a third philanthropic means of engagement with Israel, and that was to, at that time, invest in building that civil society sector. And this vision of Israel, a vision that was in harmony with their values, was the one, as I said, that was really inherent and enshrined in Israel's Declaration of Independence, that Israel should be the homeland of the Jewish people and also an open, free, democratic society that offered equality to all of its citizens. Now, I just want to pause here for a minute and say that I hear people on the left tell me all the time, and for those of you who are saying, who is that guy to say the left? The New Israel Fund is the left. Let me assure you, there is a left much further than our left, as Ellie implied earlier. People on the hard left like to say that Israel can't be a Jewish state and a democracy, that those two things are incompatible. And I hear a similar critique from the hard right in the Jewish community, and by the way, increasingly in the fundamentalist Christian community in the US, that Israel has gone too far down the road of democracy. And in Israel, that's a democracy is in danger of shedding its Jewish character. And our response is to say that that tension, that gray zone, that nuance is the legacy that we have inherited from the founders of the State of Israel and the framers of the Declaration of Independence, and they knew what they were talking about. And the vision of the New Israel Fund is that vision, an Israel that wrestles, and how appropriate, because of course, what does Israel mean in Hebrew, except to wrestle, right? An Israel that wrestles with the tension inherent in the democratic and Jewish poles that are enshrined in its founding is the Israel that we are working for. And 30 years later, in the words of Haaretz, Israel's Globe and Mail, right? I'm used to saying New York Times, but I figured that one out earlier last night. Haaretz wrote just a few years ago, quote, "There is hardly a significant socially oriented organization today in Israel that does not owe its existence to the New Israel Fund." And we're very, very proud of that claim. From Israel's first rape crisis centers, to its gay and lesbian support organizations, to the many Israeli high court decisions upholding the rights of Israel's minorities and protecting Israel's environment and working for equality in Israel, the NIF family is the leading, NIF and our family, is the leading sector committed to equality and democracy for all Israelis. Now, for a country that was founded on socialist ideals, there's something of a sad irony in the fact that Israel, which has, of course, now entered very successfully, look at Startup Nation, has entered the ranks of hyper-capitalist and very successful startup nations. The gaps in Israel between the haves and the have-nots are among the greatest in the Western world. In fact, I recently read that only my home state of California has larger gaps between the rich and the poor. Israel is right up there. And those gaps are between many different sectors of Israeli society. In some ways, Israeli society can be defined by its gaps. Gaps between Arabs and Jews, of course, we're all aware, between Israeli Arabs and Jews, but also gaps between Ashkenazim and Mizrahim, Jews of European and Middle Eastern origin, between new immigrants and veteran Israelis, between people who live on the margins of Israel, the periphery and the center. This is one of the great, wonderful, enlightening things that one discovers upon entering New Israel Fund as a donor, a volunteer, a supporter, or just someone who follows what we do. One of the biggest sets of gaps that exists in Israel and challenges Israel's way forward as a democracy are the gaps that exist between the people who live in Kiryat Shmona or Dimona, right at the periphery of the country, and those in the Mirkaz, in the center. And there is a great sense of being left behind in various parts of Israeli society. And the Second Lebanon War in 2006 really demonstrated this very poignantly when there were not plans in place to get people living in moshavim and kibbutzim and villages and cities on the far northern border out of way of the Katyusha and rocket attacks. So people of means were able to get out, and people who didn't have any means were unable to get out. And it was a very proud moment for NIF that we worked with the government of Israel after the 2006 war to develop blueprints for a different kind of emergency response to crises in the north. Anyway, social justice in the economic sense of the word has become one of Israel's most pressing issues, and the impact of the worldwide economic crisis, which largely missed Israel, as I've been told and read, luckily due to your banks, largely missed you all, but did not miss us, really in Israel only impacted those have-nots. And so their situation and the gap between them and other Israelis even got worse. In one critical area that's familiar to many of us in this room, Jews who are conservative or reform or reconstructionist or secular feel themselves increasingly marginalized and indeed often captive to the increasing ultra-Orthodox monopoly on Jewish expression in the state of Israel. Everything from marriage to divorce to who is a Jew are issues defined by the state-sponsored religious establishment. And many of us are familiar with the conversion bill, which came up in the last legislative session of the Knesset and will be taken up again this year, which would strip authority from Reform and conservative rabbis for conversions in Israel. NIF has also been very active in this field. So we have the social and economic justice field and the religious freedom and pluralism field. And we are the primary funder of both Orthodox and non-Orthodox NGOs, nonprofits in Israel, who are working to build a more pluralistic Israel, one that recognizes all expressions of Jewish life and Jewish observance equally. Finally, well, not quite finally, the third pillar of our work, you thought it's way too early for a real finally. These are just our 4 areas of work. Number 3, and perhaps most controversial, and I'm guessing an area of our work that will be highlighted throughout the evening, especially in the question and answer sessions, are the issues of human and civil rights in Israel. which require enormous support and resolve to advance and defend, just as they do in my country, in the post-9/11 universe in which we have lived for the last almost 10 years now. In America, we saw with alarm how hard it was to protect our Constitution and our well-established, over 200 years, established civil rights and human rights after 9/11. So only imagine what it's like for Israel, embattled on the outside and riven on the inside, to struggle with the balance that all democracies have to struggle with between people's civil rights and their human rights and the need for security. Now, that is a struggle that I absolutely see and acknowledge, and it's also a struggle that Israel, like the states and like all liberal democracies, can't afford to lose. And so NIF proudly supports organizations that speak truth to power, that often say things that are not popular or easy to hear, but who do it out of a love of Israel and a desire for Israel to live up to its values and for Israel to firmly be established in the family of democratic nations in the world. And as we'll see, those concerns have never been more acute than they are today. In Israel, human rights and civil rights organizations that have defended Israeli democracy by speaking these truths to power, and who are often cited by some of the most conservative critics of Israel to show that Israel is a vibrant democracy, are under attack in Israel. And we'll talk more about that. And finally, as I said, NIF works with those organizations defending the environment. Now, these four areas, civil and human rights, social and economic justice, religious pluralism and freedom, and the defense of the environment, are pursued through three strategies at NIF. I'm almost done with the primer on NIF. The first one is grant making. As the Haaretz line said, we are the founder and primary funder and incubator of the nonprofit sector in Israel in those four areas. And we make grants to the organizations that are leading Israel's public sector. The second thing we do is capacity building. About 5 years into NIF's existence, in 1984, the board of NIF recognized that giving money to embryonic and nascent nonprofit organizations wasn't enough. You actually had to help these organizations build capacity. You had to help them become strong nonprofits that could succeed and thrive. And so we built our organizing arm called Shatil, which means seedling in Hebrew. And Shatil has since become one of the world's leading nonprofit capacity building organizations. And we are called by groups in Northern Ireland, in South Africa, in the former Soviet Union, to advise and consult about how to jumpstart nonprofit sectors in those emerging democracies. And then finally, we have a series of projects that advance our agenda, the best one being our Law Fellows project. Every year, the New Israel Fund picks two of the best up-and-coming Israeli civil rights attorneys, and we send them to Washington, D.C., to the American University's School of Law, where AU donates a master's degree in civil rights law. The students do their master's. We place them in an American civil rights organization. They go back to Israel and do a placement in one of our Israeli civil rights groups. And now the leaders, the directors of almost every clinical law program in Israel, 4 sitting judges, 1 former deputy attorney general of the state of Israel, and the litigation directors of most of Israel's nonprofit organizations are graduates of the Law Fellows program. And decisions from the High Court decision that allowed women to be fighter pilots in the IAF, brought by Netta Ziv, former law fellow, former NIF board member, and leader of clinical studies at Tel Aviv University, is an NIF High Court decision, as is the very recent decision demanding by the High Court ordering the desegregation of an all-girls yeshiva in the settlement of Emmanuel in the West Bank, which was not allowing Mizrahi girls of North African and Middle Eastern origin, Jewish girls, to study next to Ashkenazi girls in the same yeshiva. These are the kinds of cases that the New Israel Fund brings. They are the kinds of issues that we pursue, and even some of the more controversial ones. The Association for Civil Rights in Israel, the leading civil rights organization in Israel, brought a case to the High Court arguing, if the military authorities of the state of Israel say that we need the security fence, then we don't argue about needing the security fence. The army knows best about whether or not this will protect us from terrorism. What we do know is the security fence could have been routed in such a way that it didn't disrupt the life of Palestinian villages. The High Court heard it. The High Court said, you're absolutely right, and told the army to move the fence. Those are the kinds of things that NIF has done for 32 years. You all can see right away from just the examples I've chosen why those things are important, and also why those things provoke strong reactions, both in those who like what we do and those who don't like what we do. Now, part of our job has always been to try to put on the radar screen of the North American Jewish community issues that are not easy for us to see. And I would say that the condition of Arab Israelis, that is to say, Arab citizens of Israel, is the real case study. NIF has been championing this issue, working with Arab Israeli organizations, with municipalities for greater integration of Arab Israelis for 32 years. And just a couple of years ago, the Anti-Defamation League in the United States, the umbrella organization for all of the US federations, and a couple of other leading organizations put together a joint task force on Arab-Israeli affairs. And I, as the CEO of NIF, am one of the 5 people on the executive because we are the organization that brought that issue to the mainstream. Now, I obviously sound very proud of New Israel Fund. I am very proud of NIF because I have been the CEO for only a year and a half, but I have been a donor to NIF for over 20 years. And very briefly, I will tell you that my beginnings with NIF came right after I graduated from Brandeis University. And some of you are familiar with Brandeis. School started by the Jewish community in 1948, a good year to start big Jewish ventures. That was meant to be the answer to the quota system that the American Jewish Ivy League universities had imposed on Jewish students. And I think that there's an interesting insight in the story of Brandeis and in the story of Israel, because it represents part of the challenge that we're going to talk about. And that is, in 1948, Brandeis was founded. Eleanor Roosevelt, Leonard Bernstein, the faculty was amazing. Everybody wanted to be a part of this incredible endeavor. Fair-minded people in America, Jewish and non-Jewish. And within 10 years, the quota system in the Ivy Leagues was gone. And today, Harvard is a 30% Jewish school, and Yale and Stanford are 30% Jewish schools, right? So already at the founding of the modern era in Jewish history in 1948, things were changing. And in North America, the Jewish community was assuming roles that were inconceivable only a few decades earlier. But let's just put that aside for a second. So I graduate from Brandeis, and I'm sure that I am going to find in Boston in 1990 the same wonderfully rich Jewish community that I had there, full of organizations. You're going to mock me, and you are right to do so. But at Brandeis, I was the co-director of the Progressive Zionist Caucus. That's right, we had the Brandeis Zionist Alliance, under which there were about 10 different organizations. It was like living in Poland between the wars, right? You were a labor Zionist, a religious Zionist, a revisionist Zionist. You had your own organization, right? I now go to colleges where left and right, they huddle together because nobody else cares about Israel at all. But at Brandeis in 1986, or whenever it was I was there, this was an incredible opportunity for someone like me. And by the way, as an aside, I spoke at your film festival last night on a panel, and I shared the story that there were 2 Dannys involved in the Progressive Zionist Caucus in 1986 at Brandeis. There was me, right, Danny, and now I run the New Israel Fund, and the other one is Danny Shapiro, who was just confirmed by the United States Senate as our next ambassador to Israel. So they were doing something right at Brandeis when it came to connecting people to Israel, but then again, it's Brandeis, so there's no big surprise. So I got out of college, and of course there was nothing. There were no organizations for me to connect to, and I found the New Israel Fund. And that for me was a way to harmonize my deeply held liberal social justice values, values that I had always understood as tikkun olam values. The idea that as a Jew, as an American, as a human being in the world, I had an obligation to help build and repair things, to make them better than when I found them. And my Zionism, my strongly held belief that I was lucky enough to live at a time when the great drama of the Jewish people had resulted in our own state, and I could be part of building that, even from a distance. And so NIF became my home. And in 1993, I went to Israel, enrolled at the Hebrew Union College, the Reform Seminary, and I dropped out immediately. And I stayed in Israel for 2 years and learned Hebrew. And I tell you the story for a reason, and here it comes. And volunteered at an organization called Singor Kahilati, Community Advocacy, which was then and is still now a grantee of the New Israel Fund, led by a Canadian Jewish Israeli from Montreal. And the idea was to do community organizing in a mixed Jewish-Arab neighborhood of Jerusalem, empowering the residents to work for a better Jerusalem and to improve their own lives. And that's where I learned about community organizing long before I ever heard of Barack Obama and his community organizing. And one day, in 1994, I was walking from my volunteer job at Singor Kahilati to the Shuk Machane Yehuda, the great outdoor markets in Jerusalem, to buy groceries. And as I walked down the Jaffa Road back to my neighborhood, to my apartment, I and everybody else at the Shuk heard a roar in the sky. And we looked up and saw a 747 flying very low over Jerusalem from the east. It flew, circled the city twice, and then flew back. And everybody was craning their necks up and saying in Hebrew, Mizaya, who was that? Who was it? And the consensus on the street, as people were arguing and talking, this being Israel, about who was in the airplane, was that it had to have been Warren Christopher, Alev Sholem, then the American Secretary of State, who had been involved in all kinds of Middle East peacemaking. And of course, then some joker says, so why is he flying back to Amman? Did he forget his keys? But so I get back to my neighborhood, and there on the corner is the guy who runs the corner store, and he's listening to a transistor radio, and I'd heard the beeps that indicate that the news had come on in Israel. And I asked him, who was that in the airplane? And he looked up, and this burly 50-something-year-old Moroccan Israeli Jew, this big tough guy, had tears in his eyes, and the hair on the back of my neck stands up even as I think about it today. And I said, who was in the airplane? And he said, Ze haya melech. It was the king. And that's how we, who were lucky enough to live in Jerusalem in 1994, learned that Israel and Jordan had signed a peace treaty. That old fighter pilot, the king of Jordan, flew his Royal Jordanian jet over Jerusalem, the city he occupied for years, in a salute, and the old Palmach commander, Yitzhak Rabin, was in the control tower, and they talked to each other as Rabin guided him around the city. And this image was imprinted on my soul, right? And I dropped out of rabbinical school. Before I dropped out, I had learned one interesting thing that I have retained. Isn't the definition of sophomore wise fool? Right? This is the one thing I learned from rabbinical school. So I'm sorry to the rabbis out there. There's at least one of you out there, so forgive me. But we in Jerusalem in that introductory few months learned about the Talmudic concept of Jerusalem, that in our tradition there are two concepts of Jerusalem. There is the earthly Jerusalem, right? Yerushalayim shel mata, the Jerusalem in which people live and work and die and make love and have livings and argue and fight. And then there is Yerushalayim shel mala, the heavenly Jerusalem, that is to say, the aspirational Jerusalem, the Jerusalem that means more than just the earthly city, that is the city of peace, that is the city of hope. And at that moment, when I saw that plane come over Jerusalem, as I walked from my day job, working with Israelis, Arab and Jew, working to build a better Jerusalem, and seeing what Israel could be in its relationships with its neighbors, I felt for that shimmering instant, those two Jerusalems come together. And Joan said in her introduction that I'm an optimist. Well, that's why I'm an optimist. Because I saw, just for a minute on the horizon, what Israel could be, an Israel at peace with itself and an Israel at peace with its neighbors. And it has propelled me forward, and that is the ethos that propels the New Israel Fund forward. Now, if that were the end of the talk, we could all feel happy. It's a great rationale for liking Israel. But we live in complicated times. And even before the last difficult year and a half or so, things have been changing. Indeed, over the past 10 years or so, the work of the best American Jewish social scientists, again, I'm not sure if this applies to Canada, you will tell me shortly, has shown this vector of drift and disaffiliation that I described earlier, that increasingly young American Jews are disinclined to engage with Israel in any way. And that's the basis of my first question for us tonight. Why? Why are so many young diasporic Jews, especially in the US, unable to figure out how to love and engage with Israel in complicated times such as these? Because the truth is, it's always been complicated times when it comes to Israel. Now, in order to answer the question, we have to make a brief survey over a half a century of Jewish history, but I promise you this will really only take 1 minute. Here we go. 60, I'm watching the clock. 60 or so years ago, the American Jewish community found itself in a completely unexpected position. For the first time, it was the center of the Jewish global community. Over 1,000 years of Jewish civilization in Eastern Europe was gone, reduced to ashes in Europe. And the national project in what was then Palestine was well underway, but was yet, obviously, and not until 1948, to reach its fruition in the state. It was a work in progress. So faced with the destruction of European Jewry on the one hand, and now we come back to the Brandeis comment I made earlier, and faced even in 1948, the year Brandeis was founded, on the other hand, with the knowledge that counterintuitively, perhaps almost contradictorily, The Jewish community that was imperiled outside of the United States was facing a very different threat within the United States that was clear already in 48, and that was the threat of assimilation, right? The threat of losing what is special about the Jews, what Stephen M. Cohen, the Jewish sociologist, calls the fraying bonds of Jewish peoplehood. As I said, it wasn't a decade after the founding of Brandeis that the quota system was gone. And, you know, a few years ago, we elected a Jewish guy vice president of the United States. He didn't get to serve, but we elected him vice president. And so in the United States, at least, the idea that there was a real ceiling for Jews was really, that idea went the way of the dinosaurs a very long time ago, and I'll try to stop saying this. I don't know if the same claim can be made of Canada. I suspect not, but you will tell me shortly. So faced with these two twin threats, the American Jewish leadership did something that most of us in their position would also have done. And I thought about this a lot when I was at the Federation, and I know I would have done the same thing. They built a post-war American Jewish community and communal establishment and a new American Jewish identity that was predicated on personal and communal identification with Israel. It became a secular religion for so many American Jews, and I know that's something that's true of Canada as well. And the relationship with Israel became a singular defining characteristic for Jews of a certain age, especially those who didn't have other means of Jewish engagement, people who weren't particularly religious. Their Zionism, their relationship with Israel became almost a secular religion for them, and it was certainly and still remains the central organizing principle of the American Jewish establishment. And this worked pretty well for many decades, both for Israel and for American Jews, but it doesn't work anymore. And the sociology that I quoted before demonstrates that American Jews, especially younger ones, for a number of reasons, are walking away. Now, what's interesting is that they're not walking away from Jewish practice or even Jewish organizations. Arnie Eisen, the head of the Jewish Theological Seminary, the conservative movement's largest seminary, calls what we're experiencing now in America a Jewish Renaissance. Right? There are all kinds of organizations and spiritual communities springing up left and right in the Jewish world. But when it comes to Israel, something is different. Now, there are a lot of reasons for this, and there are a lot of theories as to why this is. And some of them have to do with the increasing rates of intermarriage in the United States. You know that in San Francisco, the city whose Jewish community I led, the intermarriage rate, I think it was the first American city where there were actually more U.S. Jews intermarrying than in marrying. San Francisco, California is the canary in the coal mine in our country. So this was the trajectory, this was the direction, and certainly that accounted for some of this. Certainly also the reality of life in the United States accounted for something for many young Jews. I mean, that was visible to people 60 years ago. But now, in the internet age, people really can be or do anything they want. And the argument as to why Israel should be important, let alone singular, for young American Jews is becoming harder and harder for people to make, that despite great advances through programs like Birthright, which you know, your own Bronfmans here helped fund the idea that every young person could go to Israel for free. There is still this slipping away from relationship for Israel. And all of these answers didn't seem to provide the correct answer. They were all pieces of a puzzle. And last year, exactly 1 year ago, in May of 2010, I'm editorializing now, but what I believe the last piece of the puzzle finally came into place for a lot of people in America, and this is where our talk's going to get really interesting. Because a young man called Peter Beinart, who was something of a Jewish wonder kid, he was the former editor of the New Republic, he's younger than me, he's like 39 years old, this guy, he quit his job at the New Republic, he went and wrote a long essay for the New York Review of Books called The Failure of the American Jewish Establishment. How many people here are familiar with or have read the essay? Right, so al regel echat, on one foot, right? Here's what Beinart said. American Jews are liberal. They have a 100-year-old liberal political culture. If you don't believe me, then listen to this. There has been one election in the last 100 years where American Jews have not voted for the Democratic candidate, and it was in the 1920s when a socialist named Eugene V. Debs ran for president, split the Jewish vote between the Democrats and the socialists, allowing Herbert Hoover to become elected. Right? So this is the only time in the last 100 years where American Jews have not voted for the Democrats. Barack Obama, the black guy with a Muslim name, who a strong segment of the right wing of my community in the United States and plenty of other Americans on the hard right actually insist, in the face of all evidence and facts to the contrary, was not born in the United States, Barack Obama got, do you know how much of the Jewish vote he got? He got just shy of 80% of the vote in the United States. John Kerry got 76, Al Gore got 77. The point is, anywhere between 60 and 80%, except for FDR, who actually peaked in the 90s, that's how the Jews go. So Jews in America are liberal. The Jewish establishment in America has paid lip service to this liberalism. Maybe that's a little harsh. It has embraced this liberalism, except increasingly when it comes to Israel. And there, the American Jewish establishment has demanded that young American Jews leave their liberal values at the door to Zion, as Peter Beinart puts it. And again, that worked well for a long time, but it doesn't work anymore. And now young American Jews are saying, if you're forcing me to choose between what I understand as my Jewish liberal values and my support for Israel, as you articulate support for Israel, guess what? I'm going to choose my values, and I'm going to walk away. And that, I would suggest to you, my friends, is the last missing piece of the puzzle as to why so many young Jews in my country are moving away from Israel. And I'm going to argue to you, my brothers and sisters in Canada, that it matters very much what young American Jews feel about Israel. Right? It matters very much how they relate to Israel. Because, well, I don't even think I need to make the argument. Without a strong relationship between the two giant poles of Jewish life in the world, I think that the Zionist enterprise in Israel, as well as the moral, religious, spiritual health of the Jewish people outside of Israel, is in great and terrible danger. Now, what Beinart had to say was not particularly new, but because of who he was and how he said it, it sparked a debate that is still ringing in the halls of Jewish power in the United States. And look, I'm 43 years old. I have never been alive for a single day in which Israel was not involved in the occupation of the Palestinian territories. Whatever you think about it, that is a morally complex and deeply confusing circumstance that Jews have not been able to integrate, at least Jews of my generation in the US, and make sense of when put up against their values as liberal American Jews. So what they're doing is that they're walking away. Unless we figure out a way for young Jews in the States and beyond to harmonize their progressive values with Israel, I believe that these young Jews will do what we have seen them do for the last 15 years increasingly, and that is opt out of any kind of serious commitment to Israel. Now, look, I should state in the interest of full disclosure that Beinart, in his essay, says that part of the answer to this conundrum is by advancing a robust, liberal Zionism that embraces both these social justice tikkun olam values and ardent connection to and love of Israel, and cites as his primary example the New Israel Fund. That's why I like the essay so much. But my years of work with thousands of young Jews at Federation and in the work I did beforehand has convinced me that Beinart's thesis is essentially correct. Young American Jews today know that Israel is complicated, but the establishment still speaks in the same voice that it's always spoken in, which is essentially Israel right or wrong. Stifle dissent, don't talk about it, don't air dirty laundry, be quiet, right? On the other hand, young American Jews see, again, forgive me for talking about America, I gotta stop doing that. I'm like Canadian. Someone also told me that Canadians apologize for everything. And one of the NIF board members said that he actually had he knew of a situation where a car ran over a guy's foot. And when the driver jumped out, the guy whose foot had been run over said, "I'm so sorry." But I think that's a lovely quality, and we have a lot to learn from it. But I'm gonna stop apologizing about talking about American Jewry for another minute. So on the left, these young American Jews hear all too often a similarly ossified and calcified position, and that is Israel is always wrong. Right? Among all the bad state actors out there, among all the countries of the world, only one, Israel, should be singled out for a certain kind of opprobrium. And the fact is, young Jews are smart, and they know that neither of those two poles are correct, and they reject the false dichotomy. And caught between that false choice, they choose the only choice that they think they have, which is to disengage and get out of the conversation. And that's a shanda. That's a shame, and that's a tragedy, because there is a third way. And NIF, I believe, at its best represents an embodiment of that third way. Engagement with Israel, the Israel that they believe in, without compromising their values. Now, look, this year, after decades of being the best kept secret in the Jewish world, in North America, NIF really came out of the closet. And I suspect that's a Bay Area thing that we like to say. I suspect that we'll talk about that, and I'll leave for the questions and answers. I'm happy to address any concerns that you have, any questions that you have. We may agree, we may disagree, but feel free to ask me anything. But some of you know the story of the last year and a half in Israel. And that's a story that is best, in my opinion, summed up by the Israeli commentator Yossi Alfer, who wrote in the New York Times and the International Herald Tribune on April 22nd of last year that the Israeli government, this is all stuff that has developed since the war in Gaza, Operation Cast Lead, the Israeli government, Alfer wrote, is now made up of a right religious settler Russian coalition pushing a reactionary agenda. And that reactionary agenda, that is to say parties of the right wing of those segments of Israeli society, and in the absence of a viable peace movement, in the absence of a political left in Israel, both of which have been moribund for quite some time, those forces have looked to the last bastion of liberal democracy in Israel, and that is the progressive nonprofit sector, which offers critique, tochecha, loving critique, but critique and dissent and opposing loyal oppositional voices in terms of a vision of Israel, led by the New Israel Fund, and they have targeted that camp. Now that defined much of the first year of my time at New Israel Fund, and I won't go into all the sad and gory details now. Like I said, we can leave them for the questions and answers, except to say that because I'm always the optimist, I choose to see the bright side of what happened in Israel, what's still happening in Israel to a large degree, and that is that the push by some in Israel to change the character of Israel's democracy, and that really is what we believe is happening in Israel now, has been resisted by the most unlikely alliance of people. And even though the government has been dominated by proponents of that push, it has not been able to succeed. Now, why do I call it a push to change the face of democracy? Because there are 25 bills pending in the Knesset, including the conversion bill we discussed earlier, loyalty oaths that would require non-Jews who want to live in Israel to take an oath of loyalty to the Jewish state. They include laws that would illegalize and criminalize all kinds of free expression. Those laws have been opposed by the most interesting coalition of Israelis. Our biggest champion, the human rights, civil rights, gay rights, women's rights, environmental rights, religious pluralism rights sector that I work for at NIF, our biggest champion in the Israeli Knesset today is Benny Begin, the son of Menachem Begin, a guy who, when it comes to security issues, as I joked with some of you earlier, probably believes that the borders of Israel should stretch from Afghanistan to Ireland, but who believes that within those borders, individual rights must be respected. This guy is a classic Voltairean, Jeffersonian Democrat with a small d, and he and his ilk at the right wing of the late Likud party have been some of the great and most ardent champions of NIF and what we stand for. In North America, in the United States, the Anti-Defamation League and the American Jewish Committee, groups that only ever historically have voiced support for whatever a given Israeli government has chosen to do, have gently, respectfully said no. You will alienate diasporic Jewry if you do what you're planning on doing, investigating human rights organizations, passing laws that illegalize or criminalize freedom of expression, passing laws that strip liberal Judaism of its rights. But not only will you do that, you will actually hurt the fabric of Jewish society. Now, we can have a very interesting conversation about what role we as diasporic Jews have to play in determining the character of Israeli society. NIF's answer to this has been to operate as a partnership. We are Israelis and Americans. Half my board is Israeli, half is diasporic. My board chair toggles back and forth between North America and Israel. I sit here in North America. The grant committee meets in Hebrew in Israel. But beyond the New Israel Fund, the fact that people like Benny Begin have called upon the American Jewish community to stand with Democrats in Israel, right or left, gives me a profound sense of hope. And I also believe that it is a tool to inspire a new generation of connection to Israel. I joke that in the United States a few years ago there was a popular bumper sticker, WWJD, what would Jesus do? It wasn't popular in the Jewish community. Don't worry, we're not that assimilated yet. But I joke that when it comes to NIF, I say to my Israeli colleagues, your bumper sticker ought to be WWMLKD. What would Martin Luther King do? Because the American patriotism that King evinced was not a burning hatred or criticism of America. Rather, King said, I am America. I am the values that this country was founded on. And the fact that we have failed to realize those values is a fact that's common to all liberal democracies, and the sacred work is in working to realize those values. And that's exactly what the New Israel Fund is doing in Israel, and that is what we are seeing young Jews in the United States connecting to. And I will close with a story. I was speaking a few months ago in Washington, in Seattle, at the University of Washington. There is a rabbi from Seattle in the house tonight, I happen to know. And the talk happened to be titled the same thing that our talk tonight was titled. By the way, it was completely different because, as I said, that was 4 months ago. And how could you say the same things? How to Love Israel, or Loving Israel in Complicated Times. And when I was done, a young woman came up to me and she said, "I've never heard of you, and I've never heard of the New Israel Fund." And she said, "I came tonight because just like in your Jewish newspaper here in Toronto, the Jewish newspaper in Seattle advertised the talk." And she said, "I was compelled because I, as a 30-something-year-old Seattle Jewish woman, feel like I've been trying to love Israel in complicated times. And in fact," she said, "I feel like Israel is a man I've been trying to date. And it's been really complicated." And she said, "On paper, we look like we're perfect for each other. And my mom thinks we should get married already. And my friends say your J-date profile is just terrific. You're so compatible. But every time we go out, it just isn't quite there. The guy I thought I knew is not the guy I'm having dinner with. And he doesn't listen to me when I talk. Or he's rude to the waiter. Or he stiffs the tip. Or he laughs at the homeless guy on the street that we pass. And I was just about ready to give up and say, this is not for me, this guy is not for me, when I came and heard your talk." And she said, "When I heard you talk about the tens of thousands of Israelis and those hundreds of organizations that are working to build the vision of Israel that I initially fell in love with, I felt like I met that guy's gorgeous younger brother. And he's the one I want to date." And that is my message to you tonight, to all of us tonight, that the Israel who you fell in love with is still there. And if you're a person who grew up with Israel truly being a David surrounded by Goliaths, and an Israel that represented your values, and you feel in some way that that Israel has moved away, believe me, that Israel is there. There are millions of those Israelis who are waiting for you to join them. And if you're younger than me, and you feel like you were sold a bill of goods because people told you that there was an Israel for you to fall in love with, that Israel is there. And there are millions of Israelis, and they are waiting for you. Thank you all very much. Thanks, sister.
So, what to say after that talk? First of all, allow me to introduce myself. My name is Isser Dubinsky, and I'm the president of the board of the New Israel Fund of Canada. And let me take this opportunity to thank Daniel once again for a rousing, thrilling, engaging talk. It was just magnificent. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all very much.